Hey guys, the 2024 presidential election is really starting to heat up now as more candidates are challenging Trump on the Republican side, and we are also seeing a debate that is scheduled for next month. This is the first Republican presidential debate in almost 8 years, and the frontrunner Donald Trump might not even show up to debate against now his many opponents. If we look at the Republican primary, Donald Trump remains the frontrunner, while Joe Biden has a clear path to victory on the Democratic side as well. And so in this video, we're going to be taking a look at a hypothetical scenario between the two frontrunners based on the latest polling we have received. So today we're going to go over every single poll that has been released over the last 3 months in the individual statewide races, and we're going to fill in this map based on what the numbers are telling us right now. So looking at the GOP primary, Donald Trump is far and away the clear favorite, 62% chance that he wins according to the betting markets. Ron DeSantis has really been crashing in essentially every single metric over the last 3 months, essentially since the summer began. If we look at DeSantis' polling numbers, he peaked at 31.3% early this year before he announced his candidacy, but now he's only hovering barely above 20%, while Mike Pence has emerged as the third place contestant now with 6.3% support within the Republican Party. On the Democratic side, Joe Biden is definitively defeating both Kennedy and Williamson in the polls. There are going to be no debates and very few statewide primaries and caucuses, and Joe Biden will, of course, almost automatically be renominated as the incumbent president for the Democratic nomination in 2024. So right now, based on everything that we're seeing, it is looking more and more likely that we will get a rematch between the nominees we saw in 2020. And of course, this will be the first time in over 100 years in which we have a sitting president running against a former president. So I'm going to start off with the West Coast here. In California, 54 electoral votes. It did lose 1 electoral vote from 2020, but it remains by far the largest state. And so in California, Joe Biden currently leads by a margin of 27% on average. I'm only taking polls that have been done since April, and I'm also removing all the partisan polls. So polls sponsored by GOP or Democratic operatives are not going to be reflected. So Joe Biden, solid victory there in California. We have a big race nearby in Nevada as well. Joe Biden leads on average by 1.4%. Now, Nevada is a must-win state for the incumbent president. I do not believe that Joe Biden is going to win re-election if he loses Nevada. Now, 6 electoral votes are not too important, but if Joe Biden does lose the Silver State, it's likely that he's going to lose other races, especially in the Rust Belt and the Sun Belt states like Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and Arizona, states that won him the presidential election in 2020. So looking at Nevada, we're seeing a good trend here for the incumbent. Joe Biden leads in 4 out of the 5 polls that he's released. Democrats have really been scraping by very narrow margins in the last 2 elections. 2020, Biden plus 2.4, and 2016, Hillary Clinton plus 2.4, the exact same margin. In 2022, we had a Senate race here where Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democratic incumbent, was able to scrape by less than a 1% margin of victory. So according to the numbers, Nevada is going to be lean Democratic, but it's going to be a big race to watch over the next few months. In neighboring Arizona with 11 electoral votes, this is again another big state for honestly both candidates. Joe Biden could win the election without Arizona, but Donald Trump undoubtedly must win the state if he wants another 4 years in the White House. So Joe Biden leads on average by 0.3%, and 3 out of the 4 polls that have been released over the last 3 months. So Arizona is going to be a tilt Democratic state. We also have new polling from Colorado and New Mexico, 2 states that Joe Biden won pretty handily in the previous election, winning Colorado by 13 points and New Mexico by around a 10-point margin. If we look at these states just a few decades ago, in 2012, it did vote for Barack Obama. 2008, an even stronger margin for the former former president, but in 2004, these were both red states that voted for George W. Bush over John Kerry. So Colorado and New Mexico have been seeing a significant shift to the left over the last 2 decades, and I do not expect that to stop anytime soon. Colorado and New Mexico are now firmly in the likely Democratic column in terms of future elections. However, we do not have polling from states like Washington and Oregon, and so I'm just going to fill these in as solid Democratic. That's the margin Joe Biden won by in 2020, and things are not going to be too different in 2024 either. We also don't have polls from the states in the very middle of the country. They're all pretty heavily expected to go to Donald Trump. There's basically no chance that Joe Biden flips any of these solid strongholds for the GOP. The 2nd district of Nebraska, it could go to Joe Biden. However, the district lines have changed slightly. It will favor Republicans a little bit more, but for right now, I'm just going to leave it as being lean Democratic, the margin that Biden won the state by, or the district by, in 2020. Moving on to Texas, Donald Trump is ahead by 2 points in the only recent poll that has been released. And so Donald Trump really has performed pretty poorly in the Lone Star State for a Republican. 2020, a victory by only 5.6%. In 2016, it was 9 points. And in 2012, Mitt Romney was able to win the state by 16 points despite losing the election overall. So Texas is a state that is shifting to the left, but not at that fast of a pace. We're probably going to have to wait another decade before we see a Democrat really start to win here reliably. And 40 electoral votes, this is a big win for Republicans, and they've been coasting on their strength and dominance in Texas for the last 4 decades. The last time that this state voted for a Democrat was Jimmy Carter in 1976. So Texas 40 electoral votes is going to be in the lean Republican column, the first state where polling favors the former president. And now we're going to move on to the Midwest and the Northeast before we come down to the South and finish off our map. We also do not have polling from Hawaii or Alaska. These are 2 very solid areas for the Democrats and Republicans respectively, and so we're just going to fill in those states very quickly there. Moving up north to Minnesota, this state is known for having the longest Democratic voting streak as of right now. The last time Minnesota voted for a Republican was all the way back in 1972. So we're seeing an 8-point lead right now for Joe Biden, very similar to the 7-point margin that the incumbent won by, of course, that being Joe Biden. 7.1% in 2020. We're seeing a very similar margin there right now with the only one poll that has been conducted recently. So Minnesota is going to be likely blue. Down in Iowa, Iowa is a very important state when it comes to primaries. The first Republican primary is going to be in Iowa, and that is going to be a caucus. If Donald Trump wins that caucus, I think it'll be very difficult for anyone to catch up if he also wins in New Hampshire, both of which are looking more and more likely as time has gone on. However, on the presidential level, Iowa is a relatively small state. It was blue in the early 2000s with Obama, but since Donald Trump has been the party leader for Republicans over the last 8 years, Iowa has taken a dramatic turn to the right. And so currently, Trump leads by 10 points in a state that he won by very similar margins in the last 2 elections. And so we are now going to move on to the 3 major Rust Belt races in Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. These were the 3 states that won Donald Trump the presidential election in 2016, flipping all 3 of these formerly pretty solid Democratic states, which had not voted for a Republican for almost 3 decades in certain cases. And these 3 states were the ones that gave Donald Trump the presidency almost 8 years ago. He won them all by margins less than 1%. However, Joe Biden was able to win all 3 of them back in 2020, but by a pretty narrow margin. So in Wisconsin, the one that is generally viewed as the most conservative out of the 3, Joe Biden actually leads by a surprisingly big 6-point margin on average. We also did see Democrats do very well here in the midterms. Tony Evers was reelected by a pretty comfortable margin as the Democratic governor, and in the Senate race, Ron Johnson was able to win, but Mandela Barnes performed much better than expected. Mandela Barnes was the Democratic nominee running against Johnson, the incumbent senator. In Michigan, 15 electoral votes. We have another very important state here. Joe Biden won it by 2.8% last time. Currently, he leads by 1 point in the polling. Michigan is a must-win state for Joe Biden, just like Nevada. I think it'll be almost impossible for us to have a scenario where Joe Biden loses Michigan and still manages to win the election overall. It is seen as the most liberal out of the three upper Rust Belt states. And moving east even further to Pennsylvania, we have a big race here as Joe Biden leads only by 1.5%. Donald Trump leads in one of the polls. Another poll shows an even race, and Joe Biden leads in the two earlier surveys that were conducted. So this is going to be another lean Democratic state as Joe Biden is dominating in the state that he was born in. And now in the Northeast, we have two pretty easy victories for Biden, New York and Maryland. This is 28 and 10 electoral votes. In the state of New York, 22-point lead for Joe Biden, very similar to his margin in 2020. And in Maryland, a 17-point lead for the incumbent. While in New Hampshire, Joe Biden leads by a 9-point margin. Democrats did very well here in the midterms. Maggie Hassan was able to comfortably win re-election by a double-digit margin in the Senate race. However, Chris Sununu was re-elected overwhelmingly as the Republican governor. New Hampshire is a pretty interesting state. It does tend to vote more Republican on the statewide level, but when it comes to the federal level, Democrats are definitely favored. And so these are all the polling we have for the Northeast. I'm going to fill in the rest of the states based on what they're very likely going to look like in just a little bit over a year. We're going to see a lot of very solid Democratic states, and I did mess up there. New Hampshire is this one. The one up here is Vermont. I apologize about that. In Maine, we're going to see pretty close races with the at-large vote as well as the 2nd district, but it's pretty clear that Republicans are going to come out on top in the 2nd district again if Trump is the nominee. He was able to flip this in 2016. The at-large vote is not as solid for Democrats as it was before, but it's still going to be an overall victory for the Democratic Party when you look at the entirety of the vote in Maine. And so now moving down to the southern East Coast with Virginia, Glenn Youngkin may have been elected the Republican governor here just a few months ago, or almost 2 years ago now, but Republicans are not going to win Virginia in a presidential election anytime soon. The last time it went Republican was for Bush in 2004, but Virginia is not the same Virginia that it was almost 2 decades ago. And so right now, Joe Biden leads on average by 11.5%, very similar to his 2020 margin. North Carolina, however, is not looking good for Democrats. Joe Biden tried very hard to win this state, but he lost it. He actually won Georgia instead of North Carolina, and previously Georgia was seen as considerably more right-wing than North Carolina. But North Carolina right now, we see a 5.5% lead for the former president, and so that's going to be another state in his column. Tennessee is, of course, solid for the GOP. Trump leads on average by 18.3%. And I'm going to fill in the rest of the states here in the middle of the country. Not really very competitive at all in these regions. South Carolina, though, may be likely Republican, but we're just going to have to see what happens over the next few months. Ohio is also very likely to go to the GOP. Donald Trump was able to flip this in 2016. And Iowa and Ohio have pretty much been on very similar trajectories over the last decade and a half. 2008, they were both blue states. 2012, it was a little bit closer, but since 2016, they have been very solidly in the Republican camp. Illinois, of course, blue state, and so this will put Joe Biden over the top at 284 electoral votes. But we do still have 2 more states left to go. In Georgia, there is basically a tie, but Joe Biden does lead in 3 out of the 4 polls, so I am going to give him the very slight edge here, and this is also a state that Biden flipped in 2020. DC will also go to Biden. And the final state is Florida, a state that I do not believe Democrats really have a chance in 2024, considering just how dominating Republicans were in 2022 with Ron DeSantis and Marco Rubio both winning by almost 20-point margins in the governor and Senate races. So Florida is going to be likely Republican based on the polling right now in favor of Donald Trump. And so this is the 2024 presidential election map based on the latest polling that we have. We're seeing some pretty good trends for Joe Biden overall, but you must remember that Joe Biden was overestimated in polling in 2020. However, now that he is the incumbent president, it is very unlikely that polling is going to favor him once again. This time it's honestly more likely that Trump is going to see an uptick in support when looking at just polling data, as he is now the challenger and isn't basically blamed for all the problems in the country. And so when looking at this map, yes, this is the exact same map that we saw in 2020, and that is honestly the main point of this video. If both candidates were renominated again, not much is going to change. We're going to see only incremental changes in terms of the margin, and if Donald Trump isn't able to flip at least 3 or 4 of the states that Joe Biden won in 2020, that Democrats lost in 2016, then Trump essentially has no chance. So the map looks very similar to what it did almost 4 years ago, and basically Georgia, Arizona, Nevada, as well as these 3 upper Rust Belt states are once again going to be the sticks to watch. And so that will be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. Like this video down below if you enjoyed it. Comment down below who you think will be the Republican nominee in 2024, and do you think Donald Trump could actually defeat Joe Biden with these 2 presidents running against each other again in the next election? Subscribe to my channel if you haven't, and I will see you guys very soon.